Hi, this is Jeff with FrostyGarden.com, and today's topic is going to be a big one. We're going to be tackling the topic of garden fertilizers. It's so big that we're going to need to break it up into 3 different videos, so we hope you stay tuned through the whole series. As always, if you like our content, we'd love it if you gave us a like and subscribe. Otherwise, you do you, and that's going to be okay too. A lot of gardeners want to know about this, so let's go ahead and get started. In this 3-part series, the first part that you're watching right now is going to be about the very basics of fertilization. We're going to talk about NPK, what it is, why we do it, and all of those basic things. Part 2 is going to be specifically on the delivery methods of fertilizer. Different delivery methods have different benefits and drawbacks, and so you're going to want to know more about that. And then the third part is about more plant-specific nutrient requirements, as well as deficiencies that you can run into and are more common with particular kinds of plants. So we're going to cover all 3 of those topics, and we hope you come along for the ride. So why is fertilization necessary in a garden setting? Well, first, let's maybe compare it to something like a forest or maybe a field. As you probably know, there isn't some magic fertilization fairy running around and fertilizing all of those plants in the forest. What's happening there is the leaves are falling to the ground, as well as the occasional plant that perishes falls into the ground, and then bacteria goes into those leaves and branches and so forth and breaks it down into essentially compost. That compost has natural ingredients, NPK, which we'll talk about more in a minute, and that is what allows the forest to survive. So in our example of a forest or a field, the nutrition is following what is called the law of conservation. And basically what that means is the nutrients that can exist can only support a certain amount of forest or field, and the forest or field is limited by the amount of nutrition that actually exists. Whereas if we compare that to a garden setting, we have a deficit against the law of conservation. And the reason is that we're harvesting those plants and we're eating them and gaining the nutrients in our own bodies. But that does create a deficit that we have to correct in the soils, and so we have to add fertilizers into the soil in order to create that necessary balance in order for our plants to survive. Overall, there's 2 major classes of nutrition that we're going to be talking about. The first is macronutrients and the second is micronutrients. These are aptly named, with macronutrients being used in high quantities by the plants, whereas micronutrients are used in much smaller quantities by the plants. But overall, there's 20 total essential nutrients that are required for plant development and growth. The most important of the nutrients that we're going to be dealing with are the macronutrients, and these are also sometimes called major nutrients. These are 3 different elements, and they are nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, and these are often abbreviated as NPK by the gardener. And essentially, that NPK is those 3 different numbers that you see printed on every single commercial fertilizer that you might buy. And those numbers reflect the percentage or ratio of those particular elements that are contained in that fertilizer. Again, those numbers that are printed on your fertilizer package refer to the nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus available in that particular product. And essentially what it is it's defining the percentage of those particular ingredients. And the typical measurement is used in a total of 100 pounds of that product. And for example, a 20-20-20 fertilizer would have 20 pounds of nitrogen, 20 pounds of potassium, and 20 pounds of phosphorus available, and the rest is just a filler. And that filler is typically used in order to create a more even spread and more evenly distribute that fertilizer when you spread it onto your plants. One could easily argue that nitrogen is the most important of all of the nutrients available for the plant. Most gardeners refer to nitrogen as being responsible for that green part of the plant. And what's going on there is it's responsible for the development of chlorophyll, which is also heavily used in the photosynthesis process, which is used by the plant in order to turn sunlight into energy. Nitrogen is also used in the production of sugars in the plant, and overall it regulates the growth and reproduction of the plant itself. Phosphorus, sometimes called phosphate, is also heavily used by the plant. It's often referred to as being responsible for the root development in a plant, but it has a lot of important roles for a plant's growth and reproduction. It's very important in photosynthesis, but it also deals with things like increasing the water efficiency and allowing the plant to be able to uptake various nutrients, for example, nitrogen, and use those elements more effectively. Phosphorus is really important for fruit quality, but it also generally helps the plant with cell division and growth, and so it's an essential element in the plant's growth itself. Phosphorus is also heavily used in cell division, and it's also used by the plant to allow it to deal with stress situations like drought and other problems that might present, and allow it to recover from those situations. Potassium, sometimes called potash, is a very important element. It's arguably the second most important nutrient for the plant itself. Most gardeners refer to it as being responsible for the plant's vigor or their ability to respond to plant stresses such as droughts and other conditions where the conditions are not necessarily ideal. But what potassium's really doing is it's responsible for the water and nutrient movement within the plant's tissues, so it's allowing those things to get where they need to be. Potassium is also responsible for the plant's activation of enzymes, which is what allows the starch and protein production, which is essential for the plant's growth and development. There are 9 other macronutrients that we need to be concerned about when it comes to our plant fertilization. Compared to NPK, though, these are used in much, much lower quantity compared to that nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, but they're also very important. The interesting thing about these macronutrients in particular is that some plants will respond really poorly when they don't exist in the soil, and other plants really just don't care. So while these are classified as macronutrients, they have varying effects on different kinds of plants when they're in a deficiency state. Most soils feature varying levels of adequacy when it comes to these macronutrients, but the important thing to know is that a deficiency in any one of those macronutrients can have serious impacts on the plant. We're going to go more into that in part 3 of this video, but that's an important thing that you need to know just in case you don't catch that third video. Also, sometimes certain nutrients in excess aren't necessarily a good thing. So for example, with root vegetables, it's not good to have a lot of nitrogen in your fertilizers going into those soils because that can actually reduce the growth of those particular plants. Likewise, nitrogen is really good to have in leafy vegetables such as kale and lettuces because that's going to fuel the growth of those particular plants and do them really exceptionally well. So it's important to get a good balance overall of those fertilizers in your usage in the garden. When we start talking about the rest of plant nutrition, we start getting into the micronutrients. There's a whole long list of those as well, and so we're going to put them on the screen, and you can pause if you want to review them. The important thing is that most soils contain these micronutrients in sufficient quantities that you don't have to supplement them. There are occasions, like with us, where we're growing very intensively and we do need to supplement our micronutrient profile, and that's because our plants are just intensively grown and they suck up those nutrients, and so they're gone the next year. We're going to briefly touch on the topic of pH and the soil pH, and basically how it relates to nutrition. The important thing to know is that the pH of your soil can have a drastic impact on the uptake of nutrients by your plants. The good news is, though, is that you have a really wide range of pH to work with. Generally, anything between 6 and 7 is going to be an acceptable pH range, and most soils will naturally fall into that range because of compost additions and things like that. And 6.5 would be considered the absolute perfect value that would give you the maximum amount of nutrient uptake available to your plants. But as long as you're in that range, you're good and you don't have to stress about it too much. It's also important to know that some plants have a certain preference towards the pH of their particular soils. Some plants prefer acidic soils and some plants prefer alkaline soils. Examples of plants that prefer acidic soils are going to be blueberries, hydrangeas, and rhododendrons, whereas plants like plums, pecans, and asparagus will prefer alkaline soils. Most plants, however, prefer that neutral range between 6 and 7, and that's going to be a perfect value for those plants. If you're having problems where you are fertilizing your plants and you're still not getting growth, your issues might relate back to pH itself. And in that case, you can get a pH testing kit from your typical garden centers that will allow you to find out what the pH of your soil is. The good news is you can correct that soil pH, and typical ways that you would do it is using garden lime to create a more acidic soil and wood ash to create a more alkaline soil. It goes a little bit beyond the scope of this video, and we're going to do a video on that in the future, but those are the basics of it. When it comes to commercially available fertilizers, you're going to find 2 major types of those fertilizers. They are complete and incomplete fertilizers. A complete fertilizer is going to contain all of the macronutrients that are necessary for plant development, so it's going to have nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. Sometimes they also do contain micronutrients as well. An incomplete fertilizer is going to focus specifically on nitrogen, potassium, or phosphorus, or sometimes 2 out of those 3, and it's typically used to address deficiencies in your soil. Unless you are doing soil testing and you know you have a particular deficiency, incomplete fertilizers are typically an advanced technique that would be used by advanced gardeners to address those deficiencies, and they're not generally good choices for the average gardener. So if you're looking for a one-size-fits-all solution, go with a complete fertilizer solution. Also, when it comes to different commercially available fertilizers, you're going to see a number of different types, and they're generally focused on different types of growing. In general, what is called a balanced fertilizer is where the three NPK numbers are going to be the same. So for example, you might see a 10-10-10 or a 20-20-20. Those are called balanced fertilizers, and they're really good for beginners because they don't require deep knowledge of any plants or anything specific, and they're generally going to work fine on most plants. A fertilizer that is higher in nitrogen, or that first number, is generally going to be good for leafy greens, things like kale, broccoli, lettuce, and those types of things. Something that's higher in phosphorus, or the middle number, is typically going to be good for root vegetables. So those are going to be good to put on carrots. It's going to be good for radish, turnips, those kinds of things. And then if it has a high last number, or potassium, those are generally good for fruiting and flowering plants. So that's going to be good for your flower garden, or it's also going to be great for your tomatoes and peppers and things like that. But overall, those specifics of fertilizer don't really matter a whole lot. Again, you're talking about a ratio, and all plants use all of the NPK. So it's really, unless you're trying to squeeze out every little bit out of your plants, that you need to get into those specifics, and that's why we generally recommend a good balanced fertilizer for most applications in the garden. Once again, I'm Jeff with FrostyGarden.com, and I'd like to thank you for watching. We know we covered a lot of ground in this video, so if you have any comments or questions, do feel free to put them down below. As always, we appreciate those likes and subscribes a ton, so if you've got one in you, we'd appreciate it. Once again, thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.